Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are on the world. Thanks for joining us on this webinar to talk about an interesting issue that isn't getting as much attention recently, but the threat of botnets actually remains. CTA has been very fortunate to work with a group of really interesting individuals from Stanford as part of their Capstone project for their master's degree. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves and their topic, and they can take it away, and then we'll have an interesting discussion about the particular solution that they've proposed and how it could actually fit in with some of the broader cybersecurity threats that we're continuing to deal with across the ecosystem. So I think I'm turning it over to Anna to start, and we'll go from there.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Michael and the CTA team for having us. Myself, my teammates and I, we just graduated from Stanford University just about a week ago. We completed the Master in International Policy with concentration in cyber policy and security. And for me personally, my background is very deep-rooted in Asia Pacific region. I had many years of consulting experience based in Singapore, and also very much deep-rooted in digital technology and security. Right now at Stanford, my concentration is really about, again, frontier technology, their policy, governance and ethics as well. So now I turn the time to Yongjia.
Hi, my name is Yongjia, also just graduated from Stanford. So before my Stanford experience, I mainly worked in the public affairs and government affairs field back in China. And at Stanford, I also concentrate in cybersecurity and policy. I also on the team of DG China project, monitoring China's technology policy development. So after Stanford, I will be working in the Bay Area. I will hand over to Anju.
Thank you, Yongjia, and it's a great pleasure to be here with everyone, with my colleagues and our partners at CTA. I'm Andrew. I am an active duty Navy cryptologic warfare officer, as well as a recent graduate of the same program everyone is in here. My interest is in cybersecurity as it deals with US-China relations, and also interested in US-China geopolitics.
And last, I'll jump in here. My name is Dathan Duplichin. I am a defensive cyberspace operations officer for the U.S. Army, and I am transitioning into a foreign policy role within the DoD. So that's my background, and moving forward, I am actually going to Ukraine to work on technology issues in Eastern Europe. And I'll also have the pleasure of transitioning over to talking about our research. So Anna is going to share her screen here, and then we'll kick this thing off. So as I mentioned, and we've already talked about here, we are all graduates of the Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy program at Stanford. Part of our capstone research is that we're given a big scale problem to look at and try to address. And so for our group, our assigned project was to look at botnets and how to deter botnets. And we're going to walk through a little bit about how that research developed. So the team's already introduced themselves, but here I'd just really like to point out again that our team comes from across multiple disciplines and backgrounds. We really wanted to approach this topic in a way that included a diversity of opinions and points of view. And as Michael's already mentioned here, we partnered with Cyber Threat Alliance to look into this research. Just need to pause here to really give Michael and the CTA staff significant gratitude for their generosity of time. It was just really great working with them, and we learned a lot through the experience, and we just really appreciate how giving they were of their time. It was a fantastic partnership and really appreciate it. So on to the initial phase of our research. So by looking at botnets, we realized that the 99% of distributed denial of service attacks originate with Linux-based botnets, which immediately perked our ears up. So we looked to find out what devices largely use Linux and are likely to host a bot. Research revealed that 72% of IoT devices operate a Linux variant, with fully 57% are likely to be susceptible to medium and high severity threats. our suspicions to focus on IoT devices specifically for botnet mitigation as a strategy to reach a 80% solution of sorts was confirmed by Nokia's threat intelligence report. In their report, they indicated that 78% of all malware detected originated with botnets on IoT devices. As a result of the determination, we defined our problem and scope of research as seen here. We aim to answer the question, how do we reduce botnet infections of consumer IoT devices through manufacturer and consumer behavior? During our research, as many probably already know, President Biden signed an executive order to commission a working group to ascertain a national labeling scheme for consumer IoT devices. The executive order was particularly of interest to our research because our findings supported the determination that this strategy will have a meaningful effect. So Andrew is going to walk you through how we determined that this strategy will be effective, and it will describe the feasibility of unifying varying existing labeling strategies and how they can be combined into an effective scheme. And then Yongja will conclude our remarks with our key takeaways for the presentation. With that, I'll hand it over to Andrew.
Thank you, Dathan. So months prior to the executive order, the group had actually iterated through many solutions to the botnet mitigation problem. In the first step, we had to scope down, and thus we prioritized devices that had large market share and were technically vulnerable. That led us, as Dathan had specified, to hone in on sort of consumer botnet mitigation. But here the insights pointed to the botnet problem as an economic externality in the eyes of consumers who are the key stakeholders. Upon discussion with experts at Stanford, at Singapore's Cybersecurity Agency, and at MIT, something that was confirmed was that botnets really impacted consumer experience of a device in very non-noticeable ways. And consumers are thus unwilling to pay a premium for protection against botnets specifically. We recognize that solutions must therefore be packaged to address privacy and security. An illustrative example here is maybe parents who are worried about their children's footage being exposed online when their baby camera is not secure. We thus surveyed solutions that had acceptable political and economic cost and had working precedents. And this is where the solution of IoT labels really seemed promising. For instance, Johnson et al. Demonstrated that consumer willingness to pay premiums for IoT home device labels up to 40% of the average cost of device they tested. We also had the precedence of a voluntary Energy Star label and certification program, which has been quite successful in the US. And also there are already commercial American schemes and working international schemes in the arena. And so it appeared to us like the voluntary consumer IoT security label system was promising, but the roadblocks kind of facing this solution, one was glaring, and that was coordination. Specifically, a platform for coordinating and discussion was lacking, because much thinking has already been done on these labels, but there's no platform to kind of leverage everything that's available. And that's how we kind of arrived independently at our particular intervention, which is to create a working group to form this national uniform consumer IoT labels, security label system. And really, as again, Dathan had mentioned, the news of the executive order kind of provided validation for the analysis that the group had already done. And in particular, we believe the chain of reasoning that led us to this intervention will be helpful for policymakers. And since the executive order left much to the discretion of NIST, the group also brainstormed some additional details for the working group and how it functioned. So first, we envisioned two important additional responsibilities that the working group would have to complement its role in guiding this label crafting process. And that is, it'll determine the proper accreditation and certification authorities and pipelines. And in the future, it'll potentially appoint an independent organization to inherit its responsibilities. Second, we also considered who might be potential members of the working group. And experts from CISA, NTIA, and NIST were pretty evident. as well as current label authors, such as the Carnegie Mellon University's IoT Security and Privacy Label Group, UL, and Norton Research Group. And finally, IoT standard councils or alliances, most notably members like CTA and the ITSCC, who we had the privilege of briefing previously. And we could also envision members such as the IoT Security Foundation, ITISAC, the EFF, and a variety of other organizations that can bring manufacturers to the table as well. And now I'll hand it over to Anna to discuss the feasibility of incorporating existing labeling schemes into a single one.
Thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew mentioned, there are already existing IoT labeling scheme for cybersecurity and privacy, and we would love to capitalize and analyze how we can leverage the great work that has been done. So our next question is exploring the synergy between all these different existing labeling schemes and see whether it's possible for us to combine them and achieve an effective national cybersecurity label for the US. So internationally, there are two countries that have published IoT cybersecurity on the national level. We have Singapore with their cybersecurity labeling scheme by the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. And we also have Finland with the label by the Finnish Transport and Communication Agency. In the US, there is no national scheme yet. However, there are several initiatives led by the private sector and NGOs, notably two that we incorporate in our analysis, one by Carnegie Mellon and the other by Underwriter Labs. So we propose for the working group that is going to be published to not only consider the existing efforts in the US, but also internationally, because there is a very strong momentum to incorporate and work across national borders, discussion at the World Economic Forum, for example, to work towards internationally recognized standards as well as mutual recognition agreements between the nation, so that the label could operate between different nations. So, however, these existing schemes appear very differently. As you can see, we have Singapore with the 4 stars level, and UL have a 5 level. A much simpler one is the Finland, as you can see here. It's just a binary satisfactory or non-satisfactory sticker on the product packaging. On the other hand, a much more extensive one is Carnegie Mellon with their nutrition label style with a lot of information, as you can see. So how do we incorporate or potentially leverage the great elements of each of these labels? We analyze them and come up with our recommended elements that we think the working group could consider. For example, regarding standard, in the short run, the cybersecurity standard that used should be very clearly mapped between the different existing standards, such as NIST, which are the standard in the US. We have ETSI, a standard for using in the EU, as well as United Kingdom Code of Practice. And in the long run, we propose that the US working group could work very closely together with international organizations to work towards a harmonized, interoperable security standard that could operate internationally. And we also recommend for the label to use a leveled rating, similar to Singapore one, as well as the UL one, so that it helps consumer to easily comprehend and make purchasing decision when it comes to cybersecurity. A note here is that for the Singapore, we see that they use a equidistant rating 1, 2, 3, 4 stars, but we actually recommend something more closely to the UL, which is non-equidistant. They have silver, platinum, gold, and that doesn't send a signal that these are equidistant between the different standard level. And we also recommend for live information updates as well as action-oriented guides. It's available for consumer through a QR code on the label. So not on the label itself, but it could be easily accessible through a QR code. And lastly, device manufacturer could be encouraged to participate in this labeling scheme voluntarily. However, there could be potential for adjustment for this policy based on the participation rate once the label has been launched. And so taking into account all these different elements, we come up with a simple illustration. And just to highlight again, this is just a mock-up, a very simple mock-up of how we think the label could look like potentially. And this is a lot, again, up to the work of the experts in the working group. But here we think this is pretty simple, it's easily comprehensible, it's pretty small as well, so that it could fit on the product packaging, and it's easy for consumer to make a purchasing decision based on them. Furthermore, we incorporate elements such as the QR code so that consumer can expand and go through the QR code to see more information. Like here on the first level, we have what kind of action that consumer can take to improve the security of their device. And then on the second level, for example, for more savvy consumer, they can go and see the very details of each of the security and privacy data information for the device. So our vision is to empower the consumer journey. We want consumer to be able to, not only use the traditional purchasing decision factors like budget, brand recognition, smart features of the devices, ecosystem integration with whatever is already in their home, or sales and promotion, but we also want to encourage them to think about cybersecurity and privacy. However, right now there's just an overwhelming amount of different standard and different information labels. So how do they do that? Usually they just feel pretty confused and they just dismiss, security and privacy as part of that purchasing decision. However, with our one label system, consumer can easily compare across the different products and hence choose products that are secure and good for the home, helping to keep their home and their family safe, as well as keeping the entire network and ecosystem safer by reducing the amount of vulnerable devices, reducing the infection rates, and hence reducing all the botnets attacks overall. So now I hand over the time to Yongjia to conclude with key takeaway.
So for our key takeaways, our first key takeaway is that we think consumer IoT labeling can be an effective way for botnet mitigation. So at the beginning of our project, we start with a broad problem of botnet mitigation. And we've tried other ways, but due to time limitation and feasibility concerns, we think consumer IoT labeling, especially probably start with a voluntary one, can be the most effective way, because it can better, it could incentivize manufacturers and other stakeholders to see this as a business opportunity for them to do more rather than just do the bare minimum. And also we think this initiative can better help inform the consumers about cybersecurity issues of their IoT devices. Our second takeaway is that we believe it will be in US strategic interest to take future mutual recognition into consideration, given strong international momentum in cybersecurity labeling. Our last but not least, to raise consumer awareness, emphasizing privacy risk can be more effective than speaking solely about cybersecurity. So when we talk with Singapore Cybersecurity Administration about how they promote their own IoT labeling within Singapore, one vivid story we were told is that when advocating for the scheme, they use sort of privacy concerns of baby monitors at home to sort of deter people from purchasing unsecure IoT devices. We think that could also be effective here in the US because people are usually, it's less feasible for us to illustrate the concerns of broad cybersecurity concerns. But when it comes to privacy, people can be vividly told about stories about how their privacy might be threatened. So we think that could be a way for us to promote these IoT schemes among wider consumers. So that's our key takeaways from our presentation and research. And now we're happy to answer any questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you leaving in the cartoon there at the end. That is my favorite. The the Internet of Ransomware things. That's always one of my favorites, especially because unfortunately it's also very real in the current circumstances that we're in. I think that you did a great job on this research and the recommendations that you made. I think they could actually make a real difference and give consumers the power to actually make better choices and to harness the market capabilities to work in favor of cybersecurity. If you were to, all of you are headed in your various directions, as you talked about in your introductions. But if you were to keep working on this proposal, what do each of you think what do you think the next steps would be for actually implementing this proposal, working with the EO, for example?
I can start. Thank you for the great question, Michael. And yeah, we definitely would love to have a lot more time to work on the project, because this will be a multi-year project, definitely. And I mean, it's great that Biden already, signed an executive order to publish, to establish this working group to take over the great work. But for us, there are multiple different area that we would love to look more into. And so the first one is to have very meaningful conversation with the manufacturers, the IoT device manufacturers, because that is an important piece of the puzzle that we feel like we still lacking, but we would love to incorporate into, because their input will play a very important kind of contribution to the research, as they are the one who decide what kind of labels that would work for their devices, for example. And yeah, so that is one area. And another one is implementation plan. So we did dabble in that a little bit to think about, like Yongjia mentioned earlier, to think about what kind of messaging plan we're thinking of, packaging security with privacy, for example. However, there's so much more to flesh out on how we can do that and how we can manage and strategize the different stakeholders, how to effectively raise enough funding, for example, or leverage different resources. And last but not least, also consumer education. So last week we had the fortunate opportunity to talk to the IT SEC Council, and they asked us very meaningful question about consumer education. Are we going to plan to do that? Due to the time constraint and the scope of our project, we did not yet have a full plan for that. So if I have the time to work furthermore into the project, I definitely would love to look into consumer education, not only in the US, but also, cross-border in other countries, and how do we educate them about security as well as privacy, and about this particular label that we are, the ambition is to push out and get international recognition for that. So yeah, so that is an interesting area to look at.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you can imagine like all sorts of interesting discussions with the manufacturers, right? Because where are you going to put this label, on what part of the packaging? And, you could imagine, like, in certain circumstances, the manufacturers might want to make it prominent, right? If they feel like they've got good security, but if they don't, they will make it as micro as possible. And like, how small can you get the QR code and still have it be readable? So I think that those are some interesting questions there. Does anybody else want to weigh in on that first question?
Sure. I want to just reiterate everything Anna just said. She some great points there. The only thing I think I would add is a really strong deep dive into existing stakeholders. So people that are currently doing labeling strategies and trying to understand their first principles to get at why what they're doing does work or doesn't work, on the people who currently have labeling schemes. And then on the US side, so looking at underwriter labs and other organizations that are looking at labeling, trying to understand how they can integrate into a national strategy while still maintaining the uniqueness to their organization. So for example, UL has a labeling strategy that is fairly well fleshed out, that is based around a model that they're energizing, and a national strategy wouldn't be helpful if it's pulling away from them, and it would be hard to get their buy-in if they felt like it was diminishing the work that they had already done. So I think being really closely tied to stakeholders and understanding the effects of a national strategy on what they're already doing is really, really important here to ensure support across the board.
Yep. I think that really makes sense. And I mean, one of the challenges, right, is, I mean, you almost have to use some sort of organization like a UL, right? You have to, I mean, unless you're going to allow for self-attestation, right? We, the manufacturer, sort of assert that this project meets this requirement. Like, you're going to have some sort of testing and certification process for any sort of labeling scheme, and that you're going to have to involve organizations like Underwriters Laboratory to actually make that scalable to any sort of degree. So I think one of the other considerations, right, you're in this broader master's program, and you were thinking a lot about security in a lot of different ways. This was your capstone project, but beyond the specific recommendations that you had in your presentation, I'd like to ask each of you sort of what lessons about cybersecurity more broadly did you take away from this project? Dathan, maybe we'll start with you.
Absolutely, yeah. Happy to do it. I think probably the biggest lesson here is just how integrated these problems are. No matter, we started out looking at botnets, big picture, and as a tech background guy myself, I thought about technical solutions and individual device implementations. And the more we tried to scope and scale this problem, the more we realized just how integrated everything is. And trying to find a perfect solution is probably never going to happen or exist. It's more about figuring out that 80% solution that's going to take a big chunk out of it. I'm a big referencer to Lee's sliding scale of cybersecurity and like the bang to your buck kind of investment opportunities there. And so, yeah, just the integration of all of these problems and how you can't touch one without also addressing the others was the biggest revelation for me.
Sure. Yongcha, how about you?
I think my biggest takeaway is about sort of problem in terms of privacy. Being cared more by stakeholder in order them to security issues we want them to on. So I think that's one lesson learned in order to how to incent stakeholders to care more and do something about cybersecurity.
Great. No. Anna?
Yeah, so great point. And I would like to also go off the point that Yongjia mentioned about negative externality, and that kind of like bring me to the the very classical point for cybersecurity, which is human is always a weak link of security, right? So I find that probably that come back to the security mindset and the security awareness of the general public. So that when we talk about botnets, we talk about these malicious actors that want to get the volume, as many devices get infected as possible. And that means they have to leverage on the public somewhat lack of awareness at the moment to think about botnets and think about how their devices are vulnerable to attacks, for example. And so botnets are infecting the devices without them knowing. So I think one of the most important things we need to kind of equip people with is mindset, and that will be a very long journey that we can't solve that with any short-term, quick, easy solution. Just a anecdote story. So I'm right now living in the standard residential, student resident building. And yesterday I noticed, a few days ago, I noticed that the door that usually you have to have a key and a card to access, it was propped open with a piece of cloth, so that the door can't close entirely. And so like as a result, anyone can gain access to the building. And we find that, I mean, I find that to be pretty concerned for my own security, right? But I just kind of like let it stay, and for throughout the whole day, nobody brought up that security breach or like potential security breach that someone can gain access to the building. And so now typically the average person, they don't think about how to like keep the security of the entire network or the entire ecosystem. And that is what we should be able to like equip people, educate people. I mean, the current education system is not very strong in that, to be able to raise awareness within the among the public, for example. So with our solution, with our kind of like labeling scheme, that's how we think that it could, like Dathan mentioned, using this solution to tackle the 80% of the botnets. But in order to tackle the longer term, you know, the entire 100% of the botnet, I think we have to go through that kind of like awareness and education and getting the security mindset to everybody. Yeah.
Great. No, I think that's a really good point on, you know, it is both an individual and a collective problem. It is both of those at the same time, which actually makes it very challenging. Andrew, some of the lessons you took away from this?
Yeah, I'll just almost reframe some of the things my partners have already said, but kind of in a different way, which is that how integrated, or not integrated, how pivotal the behavioral economics and market forces aspect of these challenges is to producing a feasible solution. I think one thing that our program, and I think my partners will agree, that one kind of key tenet of the foundational lesson that our program is trying to instill in us is, you know, finding an ideal solution that isn't going to be feasible or taken off the ground is pretty much worthless, right? And so for this particular problem, I was quite surprised and almost intrigued to see that it's tied so closely with the economics and the market incentives of the solution, and that was just reiterated time and time again, based on conversations we've had with different experts, some of them who, you know, had success in getting their labeling scheme off the ground, and some who frankly haven't, right? So that was a really key piece for me.
Yes, and I think you raised a really good point. I have always said that, you know, cybersecurity is one of those yes and issues, meaning that, is it a technical issue? Yes, it is a technical issue, but it is also an economic issue, as you point out. It's about the it's multiple kinds of economics, right? It's the business economics of a IoT device that is very where the margins of profit are very, very thin. So spending a little bit more on security can really, cut into your profits. It's a behavioral economics where we're trying to induce consumers to do something. It is a national security issue. It's a public health and safety issue. So it's all of those things rolled into one. And so that's one of the things that I found interesting about what you came forward with, was that there really wasn't like we need a technological breakthrough to implement this. What we need are some different policies that are more about the economics and awareness and education, as Anna was saying. And so that was one of the things that I found very interesting, that it's been very consistent with my experience in cybersecurity, is that the solutions are usually not purely technical ones. They almost always involve some other aspect, psychological, behavioral economics, all those different disciplines. We did get a couple of interesting questions in from the audience. I think one of them that you should probably elaborate on a little bit is sort of the idea of updating. So how do you keep a rating current? Because a device that might have been secure last week, a new vulnerability emerges and now suddenly it's not secure. And so is it really still a platinum level device, right? So how do you actually address sort of the keeping the the rating current on a device?
Yeah, so I can jump in first, and my group mates will add on later on. So for our design, I mean, during the due to the limitation in time for our presentation, we didn't talk a lot about the elements, and also we want to leave it the details for the working group to flush out. But we did think about that, how to keep the cybersecurity standard and the rating current. How we do that is we require the IoT manufacturer to actually apply for renewal of the rating. We require them to actually provide come back with a device and get renewal testing every year, for example, or even more frequent for the platinum, for example, the higher rating ones. The frequency can be adjusted based on the current landscape or the evolving of cybersecurity standards. But we think annual rating renewal would be a great thing. And also secondly, the label itself would be static on the product packaging. However, there will be more information provided once the consumer, for example, scan the QR code, they can get an updated, most updated information on the website of the rating itself and see whether there's any adjustment, there's any new warnings. So that will be a way to ensure that the information will be the most updated.
Yes, and I think that is always going to be a problem. And I think having those solutions like what you proposed, really makes a lot of sense in terms of being able to access something online so that the packaging is not your only source of information. And I think many consumers are getting much more used to that in other areas. So I don't think that will be that much of a, leap. I also think that, there's some elements of the security are going to remain constant, right? That yes, a vulnerability might emerge, but if it's a better designed product from the beginning, it's still probably a better designed product. And so I still think that there's some utility in, driving that into the market. I think the second question really, I think, has to do with sort of how, and again, you didn't have time to go into this in the presentation, but you were sort of making this distinction between consumer IoT devices versus, say, like a medical device, like a pacemaker or something like that. Can you talk a little bit about sort of how you sort of scoped down and sort of what you were thinking about for this labeling scheme in terms of like what products would sort of be in and what would not really sort of fall into your definition?
Market share, which medical and industrial IoT devices may or may not have. And what I mean by that is an industrial IoT device might be purchased. Let's be realistic. There are industrial IoT devices that were purchased in the 80s that are still in their networks today. They just replaced all that often. And so consumer IoT devices really were the way that we saw towards reaching that 80% solution. The second element of your question was, oh, sorry, I went down a rabbit hole there. Can you remind me?
Yeah, no, I think I think you really got at that, right? It's this broad market of fairly, mass market devices, right? You're excluding sort of those industrial systems. Also, like there's probably going to be a lot more interaction. Like if you're buying an industrial device that's connected, right? There's going to be a lot more interaction between the purchaser and the supplier, right? There's going to be a contract that's actually negotiated probably for something like that, right? You're not just going to go buy, a Schneider Electric off the, off the shelf, right? And just stick it into your network. So I think that's a good way to scope it. I mean, I think the other question is, you specifically talked about this being voluntary, but obviously there are some elements that could start to be enforced potentially. And certainly even with a voluntary scheme, the Federal Trade Commission would have a role in sort of truth in advertising. In other words, they said that this was a gold standard level thing, but pretty clearly when you actually look at it, it turns out to not even be bronze, right? And so did you think anything about sort of how to, what sort of enforcement mechanisms might develop out of this scheme?
I can start by taking a stab at that. So for us, the key, again, as you had highlighted, Michael, is really to get that buy-in in the initial phase. That's pretty consistent with the lessons that we learned from, for instance, Singapore's cybersecurity agency, right? But for their part, I think, given the nature of their government and the number of manufacturers and big suppliers, that de facto regulation effect was more easily obtained. And so I think where the FCC fits in, for example, and when do we make certain standards mandatory is a game that kind of needs to be played as we get more buy-in. So I think it's almost like a second phase problem to what we have envisioned. Now, at the same time, I recognize that there are probably certain very, very basic security standards that should be made mandatory, but we hope that aspect of it will kind of be even sort of more naturally imbued because of just the way that products have to compete in the first place. And that even without the labeling scheme, it would seem like device manufacturers need to have some of these very basic rules in place to even make their products available to the market. And yeah, so we think that is a really important problem, and probably one that needs almost another separate set of eyes to look at and experts to really figure out how that'll fit with the problem that we've been looking at.
Yeah, I would like to also jump in and add one more point. So Andrew mentioned this Singapore Cybersecurity Agency. We talked to them and they share a piece of information that we find interesting, even though it didn't make it into our report, but probably a good consideration for the working group to think about, which is in Singapore, everything is voluntary still, but there's one element that was made mandatory to adopt this rating, which is the residential gateway. That means the Wi-Fi routers, for example, and that could be made mandatory because is closely regulated in order to get on the network certain frequency. For example, the manufacturer have to get a license, and so through that, we can actually make it mandatory for them to get the rating. And that's how they did it in Singapore. And they believe that by raising the security level of the residential gateway, which are the routers, is actually already improved the security of the home a lot. So that is one of the consideration that America could look into. I mean, different countries might have different, dynamics here, and there's a lot of consideration we need to think about when it applies to America. But that could be one of the options of how to regulate it.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I want to extend a great thank you to all of you for your work. CTA is very proud to have worked with you. So Andrew, Anna, Dathan, Yanja, it's been great to have you, and I am really glad that you were able to take this opportunity to share your work with a broader audience. And I believe that there will also be a blog post coming, so folks can also look forward to that as well. So I wish you the best of luck in the next steps in your career. But with that, we will close out this webinar, and this is Michael Daniel, President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance, and we will see you on the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, everybody.